Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, somewhere between that. A welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am going to be joined by somebody, but there's some preventative controls in place, and I'll make that joke as soon as he gets online. But thank you for joining me today. What we like to do here is reintroduce ourselves after the initial introduction to say a welcome, a howdy, a thank you for joining. So, if I were to do it properly, my name is Tristan Watty, and I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS as a security consultant, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in secure manner, fashion, form, and way. Might I also add a howdy to producer Jeff? Thank you for producing, and thank you for everybody who's joining in. And one of the pieces that I would like everybody to do is tell me where you're coming in from, where you're dialing in from, where you're listening from, or if you just want to say, hey all, like Ari, thank you for joining. So today is going to be a fun one. And by fun, I mean it's a continuation of this little series that we have going. We started at level 1-1, then we went to 2, 3, and now it's 4. If you recall, or if you don't, let me give you the little synopsis. So we started out with a control tower environment, and we were trying to figure out, hey, how do we continue to optimize our control tower deployment? So first, we start off with control tower, vanilla. We have the best practices set up, and we enhance it with an LZA. We started to delve into some detective controls, and we'll get into today's episode with the preventative control side of the house. But I will ask this question first of everyone, because we always like to do it twice, right? The first question was, where are you dialing in from? The second question is, would you rather have unlimited bad coffee or 1 cup of perfect coffee per day? That's why I take the dramatic pause and take a sip of coffee. Is it bad or good? Only I will know, and you will tell by the way I'm acting. So feel free to put it in the chat. Which one would you go with? And I'm going to ask my other half co-host when he gets here. But I would say unlimited bad coffee. The reason why I say that is there's things like creamer that I like to have in place. And I also say, hello, Deadlock. Thanks for joining in from Beacon. So bad coffee can be enhanced. But if you only have 1 perfect coffee cup a day, my argument is, when do you drink it? Do you drink it at the beginning of the day when you wake up, midday, or maybe at night, depending on how your day went? So feel free to put that in. But until then, let's take that little transition over to what today's topic is on, which is preventative controls. And the topic of preventative controls it's an interesting one, because there's often customer conversations that are had when it comes to how do we prevent these items. But then the enforcement side of the house usually takes a lot more conversations before it's implemented. So today we're going to kind of delve into that. And with our theme that we have building, so we have the adventure theme. So if we have the armor that we need, maybe of the magic variety, how do we put it on? How do we enable it? And you might say, okay, where do I get said armor? How do I forge this armor? Armor around my AWS environment. That's where preventative controls across the AWS stack start to come into play. How do we build that impenetrable defense by stacking multiple protective layers, defense in depth? SCPs might be a little bit in the conversation, some other things, but I think the key piece is how the actual shield or armor is constructed. And that is the interconnected nature of your network traffic, your data flows, and all the services that run in between those. And of course, identity. I say identity 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet. Because when you're starting to see the reoccurring patterns within your environment, one of the key pieces of that is, one, can identify it, which we spoke about in the detective last week episode, and how do we prevent it from happening? before somebody can access something that they're not supposed to. And that's where we have this auto repair enchantment on our armor. And we're going to keep going down the video game route because it's an interesting one. And I like analogies and metaphors and synonyms and all those things. So deploying something that's self-healing from an automation standpoint is interesting. As interesting as producer Jeff's caffeine. Right at the taste. So yes, Jeff is bad coffee train with me. All right, we have two. Feel free to continue on that. I think part of the conversation that we need to delve into a little bit more is starting to figure out how do we continue to build upon the foundations that we started. So we laid out all of these different types of detector controls within last week's episode, where you can have something like Security Hub, you can have guard duty findings, you can have AWS config. But now we have to continue this pattern. And how do we continue said pattern? Well, if we stick on the coffee analogy, what prevents me from taking a sip of this? Nothing, right? You can see it. It's right there. Well, what's preventing this item? And that's kind of where we're going down today. Simple analogies, simple items, foundational pieces. How do we layer preventative controls across our AWS stack? That is our synopsis for today. The key piece, I would say, that starts some of the foundational conversations is service control policies, which are essentially organization-wide permission guardrails that override any IAM permissions. Right? We give the little textbook definition of it. So that means even if you have admin access, SCPs create a hard ceiling that prevents something, let's say, catastrophic from happening within your environment in terms of the actions that can be performed. It's like if you have security cameras or treasure chests, right? It's how do you prevent this somebody from turning off the cameras or for somebody taking the treasure out of the chest? That's kind of where SCP is coming. And usually when we have customer conversations, part of the conversation I lead with is, okay, when you're migrating to AWS, do you have an idea of the services that you're going to leverage? The reason why I ask that is you can essentially create a SCP to block every service that you're not going to use, except for, if you go into experimental use and things of that nature. But let's say overarching, if you have 200 plus AWS services, now you say, hey, my organization is probably going to use EC2, EBS volumes with it. We'll use the security services. Maybe it'll shake out to be 60. We need some cost explorer, so on and so forth. All right. Now what we can do is we can create a SCP in order to block everything else. And then what you can do from a compliance standpoint, right? I also say hi to all the compliance folks out there. Now you can say, hey, this is our process to enable a service within the environment. And I think that's part of the SCP allure. Right? Because you can start to put a hard boundary in place within your organization, or I should say guardrail, not to get confused with permission boundaries. But when you start to go down this path, now you can start to understand some of the key aspects. And what I mean by that is, hey, how do we enable a service within our environment? Well, usually there's some type of, let's say, service onboarding process that lays out, hey, this is how we're going to use it. If we have any compliance standards, does that service meet said compliance standards? Right? Your HIPAA, your PCI, so on and so forth. And now, if it checks all the boxes, now my developers can use it and leverage it, which is a great thing. And if that service is denied by the governance team, then you can put that hard piece into play. So building upon that defense in depth strategy, then you can start to figure out the other pieces of the puzzle that you need to continuously build upon. Think about your defense in depth. We say the castle analogy, we see the circles, onions, the ogres are like onions, all those good analogies, right? If you get that reference, 10 billion points to you. But identity, network, data controls, these are the other pieces of the puzzle, right? You should never rely on just one of these mechanisms. to protect your castle. You want to layer your identity controls. So who can act, network controls, where traffic flows, and data controls, essentially what's protected. So that when an attacker tries to bypass this, there's multiple barriers. And if one wall falls, the others still stand between to protect, we say, the crown jewels, right? Sure. Yeah. Right. So if one falls, your defense continues. Another reference for those out there. So as we spoke about within our detective capabilities last week, now you start to transform those detective items into proactive preventative items that help to stop attacks rather than just, detect them. So visibility with actions is a powerful tool, right? You want to take some insights from guard duty findings, take the security hub alerts, config violations, all those kind of things. And now you can start to have conversations on how to essentially, let's say, develop something like a service control boundary. Service control policy, right? I've taken another sip of, coffee. So now that the tongue tie left us, what we can start to do after we take these steps is we can start to map our complete control hierarchy within our AWS organization. Because now that we have an idea of what services we're going to use, we have an idea of our AWS organization structure. Now we can say, hey, this is how I want the account structure to be. This is how I want the OUs to be. So with all those pieces in play, now you can say, hey, these SCPs go at the top root of my organization. And now I can start to say, hey, this is the experimental OU, where we essentially want developers to play around and have fun with different services with some guardrails in place. And this is our prod. This is our non-prod. These are the different policies. And then you know what comes with that? Baselines. That fun item that everything should be applied equally about, right? So these foundational, let's say SCPs, if we stick with that, are something that are applied maybe at the root of the organization that trickle down. And those kind of pieces can be like, hey, every EBS volume, it must be encrypted. Simple items like that, right? You can't disable CloudTrail. Another simple item. You can't, create your own IAM user with admin rights. Another foundational piece. And another foundational thing to do is to say hi to Victor. Thanks for joining in. Long time. So when we continue along this mindset, now you can start to have discussions about account level settings. You can have discussions about IAM policies and how we govern within our organization. And if you continue to go on this path, and I keep saying continue to go on this path because oftentimes what happens is it's kind of like a linear item, but it branches. It's a weird concept, but stick with me. Because when you're thinking of your defensive depth, you should strategically think of how, one, everything connects together, but two, what is the next logical step? And that's kind of how we laid out detective controls and then preventative controls. So when you're starting to evolve your environment, it's kind of a roundabout circle that's happening. They say, okay, I put in these preventative controls. Now we see this other thing pop up within a detective. So we create more preventative controls and so on and so forth. And other items also start to come into play when we're speaking about this governance. Things like tags. It's a big thing. Use tags. Please use tags. Because tags grant you so much flexibility. I know it might seem like, wait, why does tagging do that? But think of it this way. If you want to protect certain things or identify certain workloads or have certain attributes applied in a certain manner, fashion, or form, now if you have tags within the environment, you can do certain things like, hey, anything with this tag that says classified data, deny access unless you're this role. Simple things like that. Or you can start to go down the automation route that we were speaking about. And I keep saying automation as well because spoilers for future episodes. But automation is another big part that tags greatly play a big part in. Also, key pieces to consider. So when you start to go down the path of, hey, how do we bring up this wall? How do we bring up our defense? How do we bring up our shields? Or how do we put on the magic armor? Because sometimes it seems a little bit more complicated than it is. And that is where the fundamentals come into place. And that's why I started with service control policies, because it's a fundamental item and it's something that you can start to put some enforcement into your environment. Because when you start to think of how not only API actions work within your environment, but you start to go down the path of, let's say, network traffic and data flow. Hey, do you have something like a data flow diagram? Just to say, hey, how do you get from this to this to this to that? It's simple items. And we'll catch up on comments from Victor. For me, the biggest frame view, WMI event, sub. And yes, APIs. Always fun conversation when API enters the chat. But so your architectural diagrams, especially when you're speaking about, hey, I have inspection VPCs. Maybe I want to use network firewall to block data exfiltration, malicious connections, command and control, traffic, all those kind of things. But the key piece of this is you have to understand how your traffic is flowing. How is your architectural defined? And sometimes it's an easy thing, and sometimes it might be a little bit of, let's say, how do you say, complicated, right? Because you may have an on-premise environment that you may have something like a private lane or a direct connect, or you might have something in place that links your AWS environment or services to your on-prem or to other clouds. So now you have all these ins and outs, and you start to think about, hey, how do I manage my ingress and egress? That's a key component, because maybe you have something like, we have to go, everything traffic-wise has to go through our firewalls. Okay, now it's a conversation. Now it's a starting point. I think part of it also goes down, and let's jump into some spoilers. I like to go off the rails a little bit. We talk about it in our knowledge quest section, but let's go off the rails. So infrastructure protection, right? Protect your networks. So if we were to jump in to our handy dandy security pillar, how do we well architect something? Well, let's find out. If we were to just deal in, hey, create network layers, what are some of the common anti-patterns? You create all the resources in single VPC or subnet. You construct your network layers without consideration of data sensitivity requirements, components, behaviors, or functions. All of this, if we take that step back and kind of really think about it, is really based off of, hey, did we design our architecture in a certain manner where we kind of had some thought for what's happening down the line? And that is it's a good thought. I say thought a couple of times. One, because it sounds good, but two, because this is what you want to do, is you want to take that pause, that time out to think about, where are we going? What's our 12 to 18 month roadmap? Are we growing exponentially? Do we have multi-regions that we have to have considerations for? Is there data residency that we have to meet certain compliance guidelines? I think those are all pieces of puzzle that you start to think about. And that's kind of where some of this guidance comes into play. Because when you're designing your VPCs and kind of your subnets and how everything's interconnecting, that's kind of where that network traffic and the flow comes into place. Because if you have a certain type of application, maybe you can just say, hey, network firewall, just block everything from these areas. because we are only limited to this particular area. That's something you can do. And that thought continues on over and over and over again. I think that's a song, but I digress. Because when you start to go down the route of understanding how you're going to design your architecture, by simply starting with, hey, this is my account structure. These are my OUs. Hey, this is what I'm thinking about for the network and kind of my ingress and egress. Now you can start to think about, okay, if I have something like security groups, how do I handle security groups? Do I know what security groups are within AWS? Right? If you were to come up with an analogy, security groups wrap individual resources like personal bodyguards. They track the conversation state and only the expected responses. Where you have something like NACLs who act as more checkpoint guards at the subnet boundary. Right? Little differences, but they're very important because sometimes what you see is if you don't have considerations for what we were just mentioning, some of the common anti-patterns, what you start to get to is, hey, I have all my resources in a single VPC or subnet, and then, hey, we'll just go through our firewall. Our firewall will handle all of this. But that you have to take that different, thought process, that different step, because what ended up happening a lot of the time is not so much as applause. It's something else, right? And I know that applause probably woke you up, but it's a fun topic we're talking about because it's preventative controls. So if we were to really stop to think about what steps we were going to take, is that linear spread out kind of method. And I think another item to call out is, hey, like Jamie said, I'd like to learn more, but maybe get into this line of work. I need advice. So my quick advice would be to join every Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, to the Safe Room feature Security Side Quest, or any of the other great Twitch, YouTube, LinkedIn, anything AWS puts out, to get a feel for everything that comes under the sun of cloud computing, AI, agentic AI, all these kind of things, so that you can start to see where you want to go down in your career path. But thank you for asking that question. And there's also some great documentation. So I would say personally, security reference architecture and starting up your own AWS account in order to kind of play around and look at all the ways to handle security. But I would start with just watching these shows and seeing kind of what we're speaking about. So thank you, Jamie, for that question. So if we were to go back to our picture, if we have our identity, we have our service control policies, we have an understanding of our network data flow, now the pieces that we have to get to is, okay, do I understand resource-based policies for S3, KMS, SNS, SQS, and Lambda, right? Some things that deny outside, access to your organization, right, via these different mechanisms. Then there's VPC endpoints and how endpoints can help you even further design your overarching structure, right? These are, I have to take this step back, right? We have to zoom back and kind of think about this. We're looking at our architectural design. We started out with our control tower environment and then started to build upon that. But this is often what we see customers do is, hey, we built out a control tower, we have our accounts, and we're kind of building on the fly, which is great. And control tower has a bunch of controls and detective and preventative to help you. But it's taking that step back to look at your overarching architecture. Because when you have things like VPC endpoints, right, that create private tunnels between your AWS resources, you want to make sure that, hey, do I have the correct foundational pieces that coincide, that go in tandem, any word you want to put it, with my overarching vision for least privilege and granting access only where access is needed. So if you have a web app that only needs to be accessed by 2 individuals, do you grant full access to those 2 individuals to access that web app anywhere in the world from any IP address. We might want to think about that a little bit different. Unless this is a test and then we're eventually going to scale. Now we have a conversation. Because parts of this is maybe we have something like verified access or something along those lines that we can start to implement. The other side of that is going down the route of starting to get to, hey, do I have a key understanding? Am I keen on going down the route of just going to documentation to figure out where I go next? Or, and stick with me for a second, or do we go the route of figuring out, hey, there's some legends that happened in the past. So what do we mean by legends? Well, stay tuned for this segment, because as SideQuest legend has it, that's my best announcer voice. I work on it every year, and it's still the same for some reason. But essentially, this segment of our show is when we speak about customer stories, and we kind of map it out in a way that's easily digestible. And how is it digestible? Well, we have the SideQuest board. Yes, I know the SideQuest board. It seems empty. It seems like it should be populated. Well, this is kind of the visualization of our customer environment currently. This is our mindset. So how do we get this to be a little bit more, let's say, unique? Well, I think the part is laying out our customer story. So if you joined us last week, we have HealthSync Alliance, right? It has come a long way. It deployed its control tower. It developed its landing zone accelerator. And in World 1.3 last week, they saw the different threats that went through their 47 different hospital accounts, we've said, right? They have guard duty findings. They have security hub. They have different mechanisms to aggregate everything together, especially given a compliance score, which is nice. But one of the pieces that we need to do, we need to take the step back for, is this side as it continues on down the path. So we put on our epic music and we start to think about one, Russ, because he's not here yet, but I think there's a preventative control in place somewhere. But if we continue down the route of understanding our customer, we reveal that, hey, within our detecting capabilities that we uncovered a bunch of, let's say, overly permissive IM roles. Let's pick a round number of 847. Maybe that's a good number, maybe it's not, but they have the detective capabilities now to say, hey, we have 847. They have multiple S3 buckets. They have some quad zero ingress on sensitive ports, and there's no preventative guardrails. And we take a second to listen to the whispers from Victor. The storytelling much different on unmanaged devices and compliant devices experience with ASR or Sandbox WMI. Yes, I would say definitely the story is different between an unmanaged device and a compliant device, especially when you get to the point of, okay, I know this compliant device has this level of patching. It may have a tag that says this has been patched. But the unmanaged device is just sitting on your network and doing what? And that's usually the question that scares a lot of people on a lot of different calls, is what is the device doing outside of taking up an IP address and communicating with the outside world? So this is where we start to get to preventative controls. So thank you for that, Victor. So in our tail, we have exactly what we need in the middle of our conversation, our AWS environment. We have our AWS account, and then we have our sensitive data, as we always like to have, and maybe we have our authenticated user. But let's shift this user over here. The conversation becomes a different one, because when we start to think about, hey, how do I protect this? Because kind of mirror on this is unauthorized users, and they seem a lot closer than I would like them to be. So how can I see threats but I don't have the ability to stop them. Well, it's simple. You may have the foundational elements that we laid out in previous side quests, right? We have guard duty alerts that, hey, there's suspicious activity, but there's nothing preventative happening. There's security hub that shows hundreds of misconfigurations that shouldn't have been possible, or developers keep creating public S3 buckets even though it should be disabled by default, but they keep enabling it because they have to do something. These are real life items that happen because you're accelerating fast. But if you only have half of the coin, you're not going to get full value for it. I'm going to keep coming up with analogies because somewhere Russ is chuckling at that joke. So the big part of this is having exactly guardrails. These are very effective mechanisms. And kind of what we're going now, right, is having these guardrails. And feel free, anything that you want to say in chat, as always, feel free to say so, because the guardrail is us having conversations. No, really what we want to get to is an understanding of how do we prevent these different pieces of the puzzle. Well, I think the key aspect that we have to think about is, do we have services in place like guard duty? Let me rotate this a little bit. So if we have guard duty generating these different pieces where, hey, I understand there's some suspicious activity going on. And you know what? Let's put this here because it'll directly correlate what's exactly happening. Meanwhile, guard duty might be going to security hub. Okay, we have that happening, but we still have somebody trying to access our S3 bucket. So somebody's accessing the S3 bucket, triggers guard duty alert, suspicious activity. Security hub also aggregates that finding, but still, what are the mechanisms that we have in place? So how we get into a place where maybe we have some automation in place? How do we bridge this gap right here to say, hey, this triggered somebody accessing the S3 bucket, maybe a upload or something along those lines, a change in permissions, triggers the series of events to a lambda that can do multiple things, right? Well, maybe we need something a little bit bigger than just one lambda function. Maybe we need something a little bit more event-driven. And this is going to be a fun conversation. Now that we have something a little bit more event-driven, maybe we can start to think about this in a certain way where we have, let's say, unauthorized attempt on S3 bucket, gets reported to guard duty, goes to security hub, then step function initiates. And this step function can have multiple pieces. Let's say multiple pieces where you can have maybe something alert via, let's pick something like Slack, where a Slack message to certain admins say, hey, there's something happened. Meanwhile, it's also shutting down exactly what is occurring with this S3 bucket. Right? That's ideal automation. But this is where I wanted to take, that second pause and issue a good old, step back, or as I like to call it, the Zach Morris timeout, right? Because so they've been able to get there in the first place. It's great to have automation, and I may have automated runbooks, but to what extent should I be considering proactively denying these things from happening and occurring? That's the conversation that we're trying to go down. Because if there's no SCPs in place, any account can disable CloudTrail, Guard Duty, Security Hub. Security groups may have quad zeros open, and those S3 buckets that we were mentioning within our customer story becomes a reality where, hey, they can just be accessed through non-organization resources. What I mean by that is people can access it outside of the organization, which we do not want. And this is where individuals start to have their aha, I need magic armor moment. I need something to protect my AWS environment. You kind of see how this is coming around full circle. Because we watched somebody exploit a misconfiguration. This developer accidentally did X. Someone created admin IAM with this. And the solution is the foundational pieces, what we were speaking about. SCP policies, having the baselines in place to say, hey, you can't disable CloudTrail, GuardDuty, Config, Security Hub, or anything else across any of our accounts. And then locking down to specific regions. If we're only operating out of USC's 1 and USC's 2, maybe we don't need to have West or Canada Central or any of those other ones enabled. Denied, prevent. We can start to get down the path of encryption enforcement, right? So before something is provisioned, it'll just block. It'll prevent it. Kind of see where this title is coming from. And then we can start to get to a point of aggregating all these different pieces of information that, hey, we gathered somebody trying to access this resource. We gathered somebody tried to do this. And then you can start to get down or go down the IR route of this happened, this occurred, and these were the steps that were taken, maybe manually or automated, or we can figure out some other methods for that. But the key piece is figuring out, how do we scale this? How do we scale least privilege? Interesting concept. How do we prevent, let's say, a shadow infrastructure with something like SCP? Well, I think we laid out the foundations for that. What we have to do is take the appropriate steps, one back, one to think, and one to say, hey, we're only going to grant users and services exactly the permissions they need and nothing more. Simple statement. You can put that at the top of every one of your documents, because using stuff like permission boundaries, session policies, attribute access controls, these are all pieces of the puzzle, along with service control policies. So when we think of that defense in depth, that's where we start to continuously build upon it, because we have our foundation. Now we start to take it a little bit further beyond 10 billion points, if you get that reference. So implementing a permission boundary. So let's say a developer needs to create an IAM role for their application. Nice, easy use case scenario. But you can't let them have admin credentials. Well, we need a ceiling. That's the important thing. If you were to take one thing away from this conversation, is we need a ceiling. So a permission boundary acts as that other ceiling. So developers can build any role they want, but those roles can never exceed the boundary that you have defined. It's like giving the keys to build rooms in your castle, but the rooms can never access the treasury, which I think is a good thing to have. And then you can continue on with the different policy types and different analogies, but I'll save you from those different pieces, because what we're speaking about is designing from the start, leveraging the items like, hey, we spoke about the target state security strategy multiple times in multiple episodes. If not, design a target state security strategy where you have a North Star that you're aiming at security goals towards. But essentially, you're figuring out all these different pieces of the puzzle. Because when you start to think of, oh, I have least privilege, what happens if X happens, if Y happens, if Z happens? Well, that's where you have conversations, you have plans, you have architectures for this. Think about your break glass procedures. 1, are they audited? 2, do you have them written down? And 3, what are they? It's a common question, especially around audit season. It's like, how do you access this? If, hey, your upstream identity provider were to go down, how do you make changes in the environment? It's a real use case, because we've seen that occur before, and we've had these conversations with customers. And that's kind of where you start to figure out how you can adapt your environment in such a manner that you're prepared for something that you may not have even thought of, because you have the foundations in place. right? The little things, licensing gaps. Exactly, Victor. it's little things that you think, oh, okay, my environment is up and running, but maybe there's something happening for license, or maybe there's licensing sprawl where maybe we can't cover everything. Maybe you have endpoints on everything, but you didn't think of this with how third-party resources interact with your AWS environment. All these are reasonable items to consider. The other thing to consider is, hey, if I have magic armor, what makes it magical? It's its ability to, one, take more than it should, but two, it's enchanted in such a way that it can repair itself, right? Magic. So eliminating some drift before, let's say, any damage were to occur to it, I think that's a key item. And I briefly mentioned config. And the reason why I say I briefly mention it is because config rules, they act as vigilant sentries continuously scanning your environment for policy violations. And the reason why we mention it now is we're starting to get an idea from all the preventative controls that we were discussing, how config can be a real shining star or player on your team, right? Config is in the Super Bowl of services. So when you start to think about this, you start to go down the route of, okay, if it's monitoring my environment for potential violations, now I can kind of go down the route of, okay, do I understand? I have full visibility of my environment. What happens when something is non-compliant? Well, non-compliant, you have X amount of time to get compliant until, hey, resources is terminated, is shut down, is prevented from running. Now you start to have policies and procedures that shape around that. So it's all pieces of the puzzle. But I think the key takeaway of that piece is if you're looking at your environment and you kind of hear music that's not really upbeat, it's kind of this background and reminiscent music. No, we want something, to inspire thought, right? To give you the rush of environment. I'm trying to figure it out. I have these preventative guardrails. I have detective controls. How do I continue to build upon this pace? And then reevaluate. Take the pause, the second, to say, okay, this is the structure of my environment. These are the potential places. These are how I can introduce these. This is how I can introduce. See, I didn't take a pause to say it. So when we're thinking about this, some key aspects to think about are, how do I continuously keep up to date with what's happening within my environment? Well, the one way to do that is to simply go through and get some certificate knowledge. Right? I'll pop that on the screen. But the other way, which we like to do on the Safe Room Feature and Security Side Quest, is go on some knowledge quests. Right? So knowledge quests is essentially those deep dives that you use to, one, figure out what's happening within AWS, two, figure out how to leverage AWS, especially from a security standpoint. But the other way is to build some aura. How do you build up your security aura, right? So that people know it's like, hey, that person is somebody who knows a lot about security. Well, the secret to this is not everybody starts out at 400. They start out at 100. They start out as a hero in training. They're a starter hero. They're building up towards that. And the way they kind of continue on thinking about that is going on some L100 quests. Like he mentioned service control policies 100 times in this episode. Do I have a manner, fashion, form, a way to kind of figure out, oh, wait, there it is right there. Documentation on how SCPs work. Right? How do you test? How do you maximize the size of SCPs? Because, fun fact, SCPs have a limit on how many you can put attached to the OU, how big the policy can be, all these different items. So these are important considerations. So how do I get to the aspect of least privilege while maintaining maximum size and trying to limit the amount of SCPs? Well, that's when thinking through your architecture comes into place and understanding your target state, right? So kind of all these items, and that's a big part of it too, right? Is how do I get this manageable? Because you really need to take that step back and kind of look at your overarching workloads, your OUs, your structures, your environments, your lower environments, your upper environments, and start to craft this with the baselines. So if you have a baseline policy that says X across all the different OUs, okay, now I have some room to add some additional items that are workload specific. But there are different ways that you could go through, evaluate, and come up with maybe some examples. So I would suggest if you're L100, starting to go down this route, understand how to create a service control policy and kind of, going through whichever path suits you better, right? Command line or just the overall management console. Doesn't matter. As long as you get the knowledge. That's what we're doing on a knowledge quest. Then starting to think about, how do I control the traffic? How do I get to a point where I can figure out what security groups I need to do? So if we look at a basic level diagram, we can figure out, hey, I have these resources that need to connect to the outside. How do they do so? And do they do over every port or limit it down to certain ports? Specifically, if you have port 80, maybe you don't have port 80 open to the outside. Maybe do some secure. But these are conversations you start to have, and you start to continue on and understanding networking traffic and how it's routing through our overall design. These are L100 quests. But when you want to kind of take it one step further, you start to go down the path of a veteran adventurer. And I would say veteran adventurer means, hey, I've seen a lot of documentation. I've played around with a lot of items, but I'm still learning. I'm still growing because now I can leverage different services because I know the fundamentals. So if you have something like network firewall, which you have stateful managed items and intrusion prevention, okay, now we're starting to get down the path of a little bit more of details that we need to know and utilize within our environment. So all these are great pieces, and that's why I say this is L200 now. You're starting to delve into this. So if you continue on a path to 200, what's a private link, right? What is the concept? These are the things that, one, I'm not going to explain 100%. I'm just going to highlight a little bit. But it's aspects like this that help you to get enthused about knowing what's happening within your environment, within your network, how everything is connecting, so that when you start to go down the path of becoming, hey, should I say a legend? And I would play the legendary music there. But part of being a legend is starting to go down and understand each piece and how it interconnects to the part that you start to figure out, don't worry, I have this. I have this aura about it. I kind of get this tavern music. But part of it is getting to the point where I can go through and understand, hey, what is the landing zone accelerator that we deployed? Can we optimize this for our own environment in a path that makes sense? And then going back to control tower and figuring out what are the different pieces that we need to continue to consider on iterating. Because control tower has a bunch of features that are developed in such a manner that helps you in such a way that, hey, maybe we should automate some more tasks. I think that would be a good piece to kind of take a step back and figure out how we get to that. Right? Legendary certificate. That I'm going to get a shirt that says legendary certificate on it. Thank you for that, Victor. I think as we start to understand everything that goes into this approach, part of that understanding is taking that step back and kind of thinking through everything that we just said. Where if we're trying to figure out how to develop our environment, we have to consider taking some preventative, or should I say proactive steps. So do we have the controls within our environment to be proactive? That's usually a good question. And part of that conversation is the behavior of our proactive control. It's figuring out what exactly I said before is you have this set of resources that are provisioned in AWS. And there's 100 different scenarios and use cases for each one of the services and things along those lines. But do you have the foundational, fundamental items in place as baselines to help prevent all the different types of attack vectors? I would say that would be challenging. But part of the cycle of understanding is having the baseline developed so that you catch a good 80% of the use cases within your environment. Because if you have a compliance standard that you need everything to be encrypted, hey, that's a baseline that you can enforce, that you can prevent. Now the tricky part comes to maybe we have a greenfield environment like our customer story today. And maybe they need to migrate from on-prem to that greenfield environment. Now, sometimes, depending on the migration, they can have potential, let's say, technical debt, I believe is the word. So that technical debt hey, these resources may not be encrypted because it's coming from an on-prem environment. And that's where you start to have the conversation of refactoring and kind of replatforming, all those different items. But the key aspect to think about is if you are doing a migration workload and you want to have that timeline defined, adding an extra week or two to put into place some fundamental guardrails is better than trying to rectify the tech debt after the fact. That's my personal opinion, because what ends up happening and what we've seen is, okay, what we'll do is we'll migrate everything into these accounts, and then eventually, a year, 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, we'll rectify it. But during that time frame, you're still going to have these legacy workloads, as we call it, in place. And these legacy workloads, they may have different, let's say, security standards just by default, because, hey, this might break this piece or this might break that piece. So that's why when you're developing your environment, your control tower, your landing zone, enhancing it, you think about your detective or preventative control. Now you start to go down the path of, hey, we need these foundational pieces. These are non-negotiables within our environment that we continue on, one, being legendary, but two, we can figure out how we can proactively building controls saying, hey, if we're going to leverage this environment using, I don't know, DynamoDB, here are some proactive controls that we should consider, right? Require that point in time recovery for Amazon DynamoDB is activated. So that's a proactive item, because if something were to happen where we need to get into disaster mode, we want a standard understanding of everything across the board, right? And that is a key piece of the equation. Other piece of the equation, if we're speaking about how to be legendary, is figure out how do we get to a place where maybe we want a deeper understanding of our overarching AWS environment. Well, that's a good question. And the key thing I would say is having something like a tabletop exercise. So stick with me. So a tabletop exercise allows you one, to cough, but two, allows you to have a forum to express, one, technical debt, two, discuss controls, three, discuss people's roles, and what happens based on different scenarios. So if you have something, if we bring it back to the upstream IDP going down, right? So if your identity provider goes down, what do you do? Then it starts to lead to conversations about break glass procedures and kind of how things are handled within the environment. And that circles back to the preventative controls, because now you start to say, well, if something goes down, we already have access to do that. Well, there should be a preventative control in place, like an SCP that prevents you from doing that. And in that SCP should specifically have, if you have a control tower, let's say your control tower execution role, maybe you have the break glass procedure in there, or a break glass role in there. Those are conversations that you start to have. So when you start to think about it, you start to get some questions, just like from Victor. From my perspective, who can fix this developer issue with a limited res or controls are really the expert? That's good. That's a good point to make, because oftentimes, if you have the least amount of access, then you really know the different ins and outs of your product, your service, your resource, right? So you know how everything interacts, and you can specifically request, hey, I need this create control, this delete control, and this, because this is how this works. So thank you for that point, Victor. But I think part of the other areas to look at as well is during something like a tabletop exercise, you start to write down the different procedures and things that can affect you. And it's a great exercise, and it brings a lot of stakeholders to the table. So I highly suggest having one. I know it's tough to have quarterly, but at least yearly, having some type of tabletop exercise, or based on your compliance regulation on how often you have to have it. But I think it's a bigger item to discuss. Hey, how we can prevent that? Because one, knowing is half the battle, but preventing is also a good step, right? Because if you're able to be proactive and prevent things from happening, then I think you're going to have a better time than if you didn't. And the best way to be proactive, have an incident response plan. I'll channel my inner Russ and say that, because an incident response plan helps things when you need a lot of help within your environment. And I say that because when you're going through an incident, then you start to think of, oh, we didn't have this piece. Oh, we didn't have this cloud trail logs enabled. We didn't have VPC flow logs. So having an incident response plan helps you to map out different things you need to know, like your log sources and where you would search and who's going to be searching, and figuring out that preventing is the best. So that's something, we can have a great discussion about, detective and preventative. So keep on having these conversations, keep on enjoying yourself, diving into the documentation, and keep on putting on your magic armor and figuring out how to turn it on or enable it. And the best way to do that is building up experience points, 1 XP point at a time, 1 preventative control at a time. And start with an SCP because it's fun. But until next time, feel free to have some fun while doing it and go on some side quests. So join us next week, same time, same place, to continue on the conversation where we'll speak a little bit about some automation, a little bit deeper. And maybe I'll lift the preventive control that stopped Russ from joining. So until next time, have a great one. Take care. Have fun.